Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's September 18th, 2020 program, Evaluating Political Candidates Through an Equity Lens. This is the second program for our 2021 programming year. My name is Scott Coltrane, and I'm pleased to serve as the City Club President. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and sponsors. You can become a member of City Club at our website, cityclubofueugene.org. We have both business and in-kind sponsors, including our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. Support comes from the University of Oregon. Since 1876, the U of O has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically. More information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health is proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond. As your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years, Peace Health mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. It provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. We would also like to acknowledge the generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. On to today's program. In the lead up to Election Day, candidates for public office described their relevant experience and explained their position in ways designed to win votes. Their campaign workers call thousands of prospective supporters to advertise the sterling quality of the candidates. In choosing among the options, voters consider not just the candidate's party, but also their knowledge, responsiveness to community concerns, willingness to put the time in to do the job right, and basic honesty. But in these times, the broader community has become painfully aware of the ways past policies and practices have left some neighbors behind. We recognize that inequity is built into systems. Rebuilding to improve fairness and equalize opportunity requires electing candidates who show commitment to and talent for this work. How should we determine which candidates those are? In this program, 3 experts from the University of Oregon will share ideas about what voters should look for if a primary goal is to create better and more just systems of government. I would like to thank Mary Layton, former City Club President, for coordinating today's forum on behalf of the City Club Program Committee. Our speakers today include Heather McClure, Alison Gash, and Rheuben Bundy. Heather McClure is director of the Center for Equity Promotion in the College of Education at the University of Oregon. She is a prevention scientist with expertise in the social and cultural determinants of learning and health among marginalized populations, with a particular focus on Latinx immigrant youth and families. She uses multi-method approaches to gain insights into individual, family, and community-level influences on learning and health that can either create risk for educational failure or promote engaged learning and well-being over the entire life course. Alison Gash is Associate Professor of Political Science in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Oregon. Her research focuses on the intersection of law and social policy with a specific interest in race, gender, sexuality, and disability in the context of housing and family. She is the author of Below the Radar: How Silence Can Save Civil Rights, Oxford University Press, 2015, as well as the author of multiple articles on legal advocacy and collaborative governance published in academic journals. Her work has appeared in Newsweek, Politico, Fortune, Washington Monthly, Slate, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, and The Conversation. Reuben Bundy is a doctoral student in the Department of Political Science at the University of Oregon. His dissertation study is titled Adjudicating Difference, Otherness, Criminality, and the Question of Subjectification in American Law. He expects to earn the PhD in June 2021. His recent work has focused on documenting white nationalist organizing in the Eugene-Springfield area and confronting it in the classroom. He is co-founder of the Grassroots Policy Initiative and has served as a teaching assistant in Inside Out, a program offering university courses to prison inmates. He has earned graduate and undergraduate degrees at the University of Oregon and the University of Texas at Tyler. On to today's program. We have some questions for the presenters. A little bit about your background. What led you to focus on an equity lens in your research? And how did your training and experience lead you to focus on this topic? Alison, we'll start with you.
Great. And again, thanks for having me here, and a quick word of support to the hundreds of thousands of families in Oregon who've had to leave their homes, who've lost belongings, who've lost loved ones. We're all grieving with you and grieving for you and here for you. And so for those of you who are listening, thanks so much. So my pathway to researching issues of equity, to researching issues of social justice and inequality is really an extension of the work that I've been doing my whole working life. I started working in earnest in social justice in college. I had a bunch of different experiences working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, working in a maximum security prison, working for disenfranchised families through the family court system. When I graduated from college, I had a fortunate opportunity to work for the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, and then later worked for a law firm that focused on housing discrimination, lending discrimination, and public accommodations discrimination. And then had a full career after that, working in public policy, working on issues of affordable housing and worker reinvestment. And so when I finally decided to check out of the working world, I really wanted to sit back and analyze those arenas where I had spent so much time actually working as an activist and as a policy consultant. And so that research that I focus on, and I focus quite a bit on these intersections of disenfranchisement in public policy and in law in the United States, that focus is really just a reflection of the work that I've done and the work that I continue to do. And I'm really fortunate that U of O is such a great place to do that work, because there's a lot of us that have that background and a lot of us that have that focus, and an administration that really values that kind of practical social justice lens. So it's really a great place for folks who are interested in working on those issues to end up, because we have a lot of faculty who have a similar set of research experiences.
Thank you. Reuben, you're up next.
Hi, yes. My name is Heather Bundy. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon in the political science department, and Dr. Gash is actually my dissertation advisor. How did I've thought about this question all day since you emailed it out, and it's really difficult. Like Dr. Gash just pointed out, it's really difficult to describe how you get to a moment where you realize that your research is really about, the way I put it is, your research is really about your life, but not in a negative or egotistical way, just in the sense that this is what you've been doing, right? So my background, I've been in the anti-racist, anti-white nationalist organizing effort since probably the 8th grade. A race riot broke out at my school over an interracial relationship, being biracial. I was a victim of said race riot. 4 years later, before I graduated high school, the movie Malcolm X came out. There was another race riot at a school that my mom had moved me to because she didn't want me to be involved in any more race riots, ironically, but like we were in the South. So like, this is just a thing. All right. I met my first Klansman when I was like 15 years old at a restaurant I was working at. He introduced himself as a Klansman, openly identified it as a Klansman, and then reminded me that I didn't have anything to worry about because I was a good boy and I knew my place. It was at that point that I realized that I most emphatically, right, didn't know my place. Like, I want to be clear about that. I do not know my place. Like, Dr. Gash can testify to that, right? But like, the point is, right, like my research now is about criminality, and it's about how discourses, ostracizing discourses like criminality, social and sexual deviancy, things like that, how they lock people completely outside of the system, like no access to anything. Dehumanizing isn't even a word for what they become. Anti-human, right? And what I've realized is, and of course with working with Dr. Gash, right, who again along the way reminded me that my work wouldn't have any meaning unless I was able to take the things that I'm passionate about and research them and really understand what was going on with them, right? Again, back to like the things that I'd experienced in my life, right? So like, it's a really difficult question to answer, like how I got here. Like the easiest answer is to probably say like, in one way, shape or form, I've always been here. And since I've always been here, like I'm fascinated on a number of levels, right? As someone who studies criminology and things like that, and the politics of that, I'm currently interested in this moment in the way that criminal justice discourses are being used in the election. I am, you know, of course, fascinated with race, but also I'm here as an activist. I'm here as, you know, since I've been here, I've had the fortune of working with one of the many neutral de-escalation teams that's been working to keep these rallies at, you know, keep these rallies from turning violent, keep these rallies nonviolent, things like that, right? And so like, I've been really fortunate to like plug into a community here who was faced with a problem, knew they needed to do something, didn't know what to do. Luckily, me and other people from outside the community had grown up in places where this was just the walking around reality, right? And like, I've been fortunate enough, both in my academic world, like Dr. Gash has said, like the faculty that I've worked with, like I've found surprising allies, right? Like to my work, like, and I mean that in the best possible ways, like international relations scholars who are talking to me about like, and comparative politics scholars who are talking to me about the way that what I'm talking about plugs into like what they're talking about, right? Which is not the norm for a political theorist. It's just not the norm. We don't talk to anybody but the old dead people who write our philosophy books. Like that's who we talk to, right? Okay, but like, I'm sorry, I've taken up way too much time, but my point is, right, like that's, like it, to me, like my final answer is like, how did I get here to City Club, right, on this today? And it is because I'm fascinated by this moment, and I'm fascinated just by the do or die sort of like moment that we are in. Sorry, Heather, for talking so long.
That's great. And now, Heather, if you could tell us a little bit about the center that you're the director of, and it's community-based research.
Absolutely. I thank you, Alison and Reuben. I just wanted to comment on one thing that Reuben said that really struck me, that your research is about your life, because that strikes me as a gorgeous description of the intersection of social justice and academia. And I think that has really powerful implications for our conversation today. And that when we think about equity, part of what we might reflect upon together are the ways that the most effective political leaders that we can have are those who refuse to divorce the lessons and insights from their own lives from their service, and bring to their service to all of the rest of us their own experiences of having to be strong, but also having to be really incisive and insightful from also not knowing their place, and the importance of electing precisely those people to public office, folks who have a history of not knowing their place. So thank you, Reuben. I'm really excited to come back to this in the discussion. But a little about me and our center. So I am a researcher and an instructor in the University of Oregon's College of Education, and I direct the Center for Equity Promotion, which is a research center. So before moving to Oregon in 2005, I lived in Chicago and Washington, D.C., and I helped lead community-partnered research focused on the health and well-being of Latin American immigrants and their families in those cities. I also researched and provided expert witness testimony in asylum cases based on sexual orientation or gender identity involving individuals from Latin America. So my training in cultural anthropology and Latin American history prepared me to privilege the experiences and understandings of everyday people, which is also core to equity, in which we strive to respond to what individuals and communities need, which is equity, responding to what individuals and communities need, rather than equality, which is providing the same thing to everyone. So to describe briefly how and why we work at our Center for Equity Promotion, I believe that some of our center hows and whys have relevance for our conversation today. So our researchers partner with Latinx immigrant families, teachers and families in the federated states of Micronesia and in the Pacific Island communities of Oregon, students who are emerging bilinguals, incarcerated parents, and school staff desperate to hang on to their most vulnerable students through embracing restorative discipline. Given this diversity, what then unites us in our center? We all work to better understand and support the positive development of children and families and their schools and communities. We focus on those who bear the greatest burden of health and education disparities related to adverse social and economic conditions. Our research informs culturally specific prevention, intervention, and policy efforts that build on community strengths. Our aim is to improve the ability of education, health, and social services to be more inclusive, effective, and responsive to the needs and the assets of underserved communities. In short, we strive to listen to our research partners and participants and describe their world as it is in all of its beauty and hardship, and then work together for the world as it should be. To highlight two principles that guide our work, we continually check ourselves and our motives. We continually ask ourselves, who benefits? And we strive to keep ourselves accountable. We do this because we believe, as Lila Watson, an Australian Aboriginal leader, said, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because you realize your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us walk together. Second, our collective work helps to create more possibilities for belonging. As First Lady Michelle Obama writes, so many of us go through life with our stories hidden, feeling ashamed or afraid when our whole truth doesn't live up to some established ideal. We grow up with messages that tell us that there's only one way to be American, that if our skin is dark or our hips are wide, if we don't experience love in a particular way, if we speak another language or come from another country, then we don't belong. That is, until someone dares to start telling that story differently. I believe these drivers toward accountability and belonging also guide our most effective elected leaders and public servants, and that's something I'm really eager to discuss more with this esteemed group.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
So we have a series of questions for all three of you, based on the idea that voters are probably concerned about equity and racial justice. And the first question is, what should voters look for or ask of candidates as they consider their options this election year? Who's first?
I'll dive in with a thought and would love for Alison and Reuben to make this better. My first question is, what are the challenges that are identified, and who's identifying them? Who's in the conversation and whose needs and solutions are foremost. The nature of our and I'm in the presence of political scientists, so I'm going to say this and then leave this for you and for Alison and Reuben to improve upon as our political science
I'm
experts.
taking notes, just so we're clear.
Excellent. We have a participatory democracy that is supposed to be representative and fails dismally. And there are also successes. How do we improve the successes? And part of that is really working with public officials and pressing public officials to be as inclusive in the sheer conversation, the definition of what is important in terms of focus. Because focus is attention, it's time, and it's resources. It's the importance of being counted. This is the travesty that is the shortening of the timeline for the census count. That how are we going to be as representative, have as many voices to speak to the immediate needs, because we can't have equitable access nor equitable outcomes if we don't have the provision of what each community and person truly needs in order to be involved, whether that's voting rights, whether that is access to information in languages that are diverse and that can be fully understood by people who are engaged in our political process, that it is possible to be a person who is eligible to vote and maybe not grok important information about elections and issues in English. They're very straightforward concerns that our elected officials and the entire apparatus that is our voting system can be attentive to ensure the greatest representation possible. And then it's the actionable items that are selected. How do we follow through and arrive at solutions that benefit very particular constituencies in ways that are meaningful, that have impact? All right, you two.
Alison, you're up.
Can you just repeat the question one more time? Because I sort of traveled down a rabbit hole in my brain and I wanted to make sure I circled back.
What should voters look for, in particular, this election season? What can they ask of candidates if they're committed to equity and racial justice?
Yeah. Okay, great. So I would say, you know, it's getting harder and harder to figure out from the rhetoric that candidates use whether or not they are actually committed to equity as opposed to speaking the sort of vague language of equity. And so it's really, you know, it makes the job of voters a little bit more difficult because you don't want to put all of your investment into a candidate who doesn't actually intend to devote some significant thinking to the experiences of communities that are consistently disenfranchised in our state and in our country. And so you have to really do some research to figure out, is this something that candidates are talking about now because it's a moment? Or is this something that candidates really fully understand to be a structural, systemic, ongoing problem of exclusion, of dehumanization, of violence that is really part and parcel of our history, right? And that is easier to parse out if you just have to take a little bit of look, you know, into the person's background, into stuff they've said, into the kind of policies they support. But fundamentally, if you're a privileged voter, right? If you're somebody that hasn't been on the receiving end of policies that are doing violence to your family, doing violence to your community, taking food off your table, taking education opportunities away from your children. If you're somebody who has that kind of privilege where you haven't had to deal with those particular challenges, then you need to have a little bit of an empathic approach, which is to think about, if I were somebody who struggles, if I were somebody who is constantly on the losing end of what the state continues to put out there in terms of policy, how would I read this candidate? Would I read this candidate as somebody that understands the world that I live in? Would I read this candidate as somebody who is going to work for my interests? Would I read this candidate as somebody who really understands the complexity and the range of obstacles and struggles that I experience every day? Or would I read this candidate as somebody that's doing lip service, but ultimately isn't going to be doing much? So it takes a little bit of, for the privileged voter to be thinking outside of their own experiences and maybe outside of their own specific personal interests, and then to think about, if I were somebody who really struggles in these ways, would I look at this person as being the kind of person who would do right by me?
Thank you. Reuben, do you have anything to add?
A little bit, not much, obviously. I just mostly want to echo, there are a couple of things. Like, now, one of my favorite democratic theorists is Benjamin Barber. And he said one time, I think it was in Consumed, he said, you know, the problem with the idea of democracy and choice currently is that we ask voters to pick candidates much in the same way that we ask them to pick soap in the aisle of Walmart. And he said, surely picking, you know, picking an elected leader needs to like operate on different parameters than the most bang for your buck, right? And so, like, I don't know, I feel like the more I think about it, like I'm divided, because on the one hand, it seems like we have a message, voters of color have a message, BIPOC voters have a message for, you know, white voters, but that message is split between conservative voters and progressive voters in this moment, right? And for progressive voters, we would ask you to recognize that, I want to stop. I would ask you to recognize, I don't in any way speak for, like, there is no such thing as a BIPOC community, right? Like, we are just a group, like we are a group of marginalized intersectional people. We run the gamut of political ideologies, the whole bit, right? And so first and foremost, I would ask that maybe we stop thinking about equity in terms of equity voting, in terms of, like, you know, what progressives can do, but also begin to speak to our conservative, like, people of color, and ask them what they can do. And, you know, that message is, who's, you know, like Heather said originally in the beginning, whose interests are you really voting for, right? Like ostensibly we voted for Trump. I'm speaking to my conservative friends now. Ostensibly we voted for Trump because it was good for our pocketbook. Well, that didn't work. And, you know, fine, like COVID, all of that stuff, right? But like, these are more problems that need to be addressed on the horizon, which means that you have more interests at play. And we need to start picking candidates who can handle the added burden of these problems going forward. Because, you know, from my perspective, someone like Gavin Newsom was right? Like, this isn't a climate disaster. This is the new climate. This is what the world looks like. It is on fire during the summer, right? And that is going to be a problem specifically for voters of color, because we tend to, you know, we tend to have our voices, you know, lost the most in the environmental struggle, right? It's going to be a disaster if we continue to vote based on someone else's interest, or based on what people are telling us our interests are in any given moment. And for my progressive, you know, friends of color, the question is now exactly what, you know, exactly as Cornel West put it. You know, which one of these candidates is going to make your job of fighting for your own survival and your collective survival easier, right? It's no longer a question of whether or not the Democratic Party or the Republican Party can, you know, supply the needs of the BIPOC community. We are past that, right? Like Malcolm X said, we are beyond that. We are to a moment now where the question is, how much more, for me at least, how much more work am I going to have to do as an organizer, as a community organizer, under Trump versus under Biden, right? The assumption is that I don't get a vacation. Neither do my progressive people of color friends. None of us are getting days off. So vote Like when you're voting, think about this. Think about what is going to make it easier for you to organize your community, and then make your choice. For my conservative white friends, I would ask you to think about your arguments about tyranny, about the reason for the Second Amendment, about all of these things that you're putting forward. And I would ask you to take a good hard look at the party who doubled down, who presented a platform that was nothing but a statement of support for the current president, right? Like I would ask you to begin asking questions about whether or not you can actually vote tyranny into office, as you know, Madison and the framers said you could and warned against. For my progressive white friends, I would ask y'all to recognize, right, that like, I don't know, I would ask y'all to like recognize that in this moment, what we need is not another person to speak for us, but a person to rend open space and allow us to speak. Like Heather's Center is a prime example. The work they are doing is so good, right? So good. Here's the rub. When I got the initial email, I, as a BIPOC person, graduate student on the University of Oregon campus, had to then go look up what her center was and what they were doing, because it's not really as well known on campus perhaps as it should be, right? We need white progressives to begin asking questions about how are we legitimately going to fill the progress gap in a technocracy where STEM education, where education, forget STEM, where it has been completely gutted for anybody below the $60,000 or $150,000 a year family line. Like, how do we begin to fill that gap? That's what I would ask my progressive friends to think about as they go into the voting chamber. I'm sorry, again, I know that was really long. I apologize.
No, thank you. Moving along, are there specific issues you think candidates should be covering? And maybe focus a bit on Oregon here. So we have mail-in voting, but maybe redistricting. Are there things, election access, or things like that? Or anything else?
I would say certainly one of the things that's been raised recently as a result of the fires and COVID is the extraordinary burdens that low-income workers, that workers of color, that migrant workers in particular face when our economy goes into collapse. I think a lot of us take for granted the fact that we're able to quarantine, we're able to continue to get food on our table, we're able to ride out these fires, some of us anyway, in relative safety, while other folks are out there continuing to expose themselves and their families to the virus, continuing to have to be out in the air, breathing in whole hosts of toxins because of the fires, because they don't have the same kind of freedom to be able to work from home, and they have to put food on their table, and they're not being given an opportunity to take that time to spend with their family. And so, migrant workers, for instance, right now are out there picking grapes and picking produce so that Oregonians have food on their table, and they don't have masks. They don't have N95 or KN95 masks. They aren't being told what options they can take in terms of protecting their own health, their own welfare. And there aren't any real policies in place that speak to those particular populations. And I think the more that we realize that we're going to be living in an unstable climate, both in terms of our health, COVID, more viruses in the future, and in terms of our economy, and then in terms, obviously, of the new norm with the climate, we need to be able to build in some real policy safeguards for those communities that are most vulnerable, but that we also lean on the most in the times of real chaos.
Heather.
I'm thinking about Alison's earlier comment about the importance of empathy, and Reuben speaking to the complexity of groups that often get described as monoliths, like people of color. and I'm thinking about this question about specific issues. And I want to step back just a bit and talk about the process through which the issues are articulated and represented. Because I think that many of our elected leaders, particularly here in Oregon, are white. And I think that the particular challenges the reality of white privilege is something that is so critical, that is acknowledged and worked with by coalitions working in concert with white representatives. And there are tremendous realities, I think, that can be addressed creatively and effectively when an issue is articulated through a coalition-based approach. And that group then, which is ethnically and racially diverse, because there are very few issues in our state that don't have very clear impacts that are different. And also there can be similarities across communities, such as Alison provided the beautiful example of the impact of smoke and climate change, as Reuben was speaking to. But the question of issues, if our elected leaders take the time to build relationships rooted in trust and authenticity and transparency, which that is an enormous investment. And many of our best leaders already have those relationships. It's why they're in office. But then to have the issues articulated from a coalition approach, but equally important is the decision of who is best positioned to speak to these issues, to articulate the issues and the approaches, because there are often solutions that are devised and have been existing for decades within communities that are historically and even to the present day marginalized, that work really well. And if communities can speak to their own challenges and solutions, if leaders from those communities, part of what needs to happen, Reuben spoke to at the beginning of this session, which is a profound opening up of who leaders are. And the reality is that there are extraordinary community-based leaders whose voices are not being lifted to the level of the state or even to the level of Lane County leadership. And we can change that. That's the work that I see you doing, Reuben. That's the work that I see happening within our university. That's the work that I see happening within Lane County. And that when there are white leaders who recognize that because of their white privilege, we have opportunities to open doors that may not be as easily or readily accessible to our colleagues and to to the leaders within our movements who are of color, then we get as a group, as a coalition, to decide strategically, how do we raise this issue? How do we move this issue forward? And who is the best positioned to do this? And it may not be the white elected leader. And what that means is that there is a need for active ongoing listening, for understanding. There is an active need for humility, and there is an active need to continually focus on what matters and how do we get there and who is the best to speak to this issue and to move this along. And it may be the white elected representative, but it may not be. And the reason this is important is because we are a changing nation and we are a changing state. And the beauty of this moment, which is steeped in blood and heartbreak, is that we are grappling in a familiar way, which has some new nuances, with the profound histories of oppression and of annihilation that really are roots of this country. And that can give rise to different ways of leading and different ways of facilitating and catalyzing change that are bottom up, but can be met with top-down approaches.
That makes me think now, what about the social justice protests that have been going on for a while now? Reuben, maybe you can handle this one. How has that changed the calculations?
I mean, like, first of all, perfect segue, because like most of what I wanted to say in regard to that question was like from this position, but specifically in reference to what Dr. McClure has already brought up several times. And it's this idea of like what I want to see from candidates is, and what I feel more than anything, if just my experience, so my experience as a de-escalator is, yeah, we are actually at these rallies, but most of our work is actually done behind the scenes, talking to the organizers and things like that. And, getting a lay of the land and really working with them and so on and so forth. And we try to maintain really good working relationships with all of the groups involved, right? But like, one of the things that I've noticed from that perspective is, right, like, I think what both sides want to see from their elected leadership is, and especially, the protest now, it is a message on how we're going to collectively manage, our community going forward, right? Like the root to me of the defund the police movement is based in an idea that policing as it is currently as it currently exists is outmoded at best, right? Outmoded at best, right? And what keeps these kids, going back out to the streets over and over and over and over again, from my perspective, is a lack of responsiveness on the part of city government, a lack of responsiveness on the part of Lane County, and a lack of responsiveness on the part of state government to legitimate demands that are coming from the streets. Like, I can't speak to Portland, and I won't speak to Portland. I don't know what's going on in Portland. I'm not there. I'm not a part of that movement. But here, right, like, this is why they continually go and have protests at Lane County Jail, because there is a hunger strike going on, because inmates have filed federal complaints. Well, here's the thing, dude, like, the federal courts are what they are. They have a job. They need to be up and running. It went to the county courts first. The county courts were closed because of COVID. So it made its way to the, federal court. Federal courts didn't answer it because of COVID. So now inmates are on hunger strike, right? They keep going back to call attention to the fact that nobody will hear the damn case. Forgive my language, but nobody will hear the damn case. That's dumb. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life, that these kids keep having to go back to the county jail and face down tear gas. And yeah, look, don't get me wrong. Like, I've been at a lot of those protests. I did a teach-in at one of those protests on legal mobilization and how to engage in actions in solidarity with people inside of jail who face actual physical threat of violence in riot situations. If you don't believe me, look up like the protocols for forcible extraction from a cell, right? Look at what they're allowed to use in those situations. But, right, some of those protests got rowdy. Some of those protests destroyed public property. And the one that I was at where that happened, they literally tore down a fence and they busted out a windshield. So we're talking about $400, maybe $500 worth of damage. Okay? Tear gas, right? My point is, it's dumb that they keep having to go down and face this down, when all they're asking the community is to hear a case, right? It's a simple question of responsiveness. The government is not being responsive to their demands. Now look at the right. Like, yeah, look, like the right is gassing a lot and having a really good time messing with these quote unquote Antifa kids with Blue Lives Matter and stuff like that. And like, yeah, they're having a great time, fine. But also underneath that, right, is a general call amongst them through places like Timber Unity and stuff like that, that is asking the question, how are we going to collectively manage our economic future? Because a lot of our stuff has been on the line here, right? And like, for me, one of the biggest problems as a biracial person, right, who grew up in a proud household with a single white mother, race traitor, right? And like race traitor status is a real thing in the South, especially in the 80s, right? Like white women who have children outside of their race are completely locked out of the society, period. It's been there since the Maryland Durante Vita laws. White women were put right alongside Black men for slavery, for being engaging in interracial relationships, right? But like, this is my point, right? Like at that line, like there's so many things that just don't, like at the middle class line, at, you know, whatever you want to call it, right? I call it the $150,000 family line, right? At the line where, you know, COVID didn't affect you, right? Because your job was easily translated to home, things like that, right? A lot of these things that these kids are bringing out don't meet the burden of a policy demand because they're ugly. And yeah, they're ugly. Look, like seeing a police station on fire is ugly. It is scary. It's also kind of supposed to be because it's a message about how scary those people's lives are. Right? I come from a neighborhood where if the police got called, it was a full-blown SWAT team, a helicopter, and literally everybody plus the neighbors out on the ground while they figured out what was happening. Right? It wasn't no accident that DPD shot somebody in their own home going into the wrong house, right? Like that wasn't an accident. But like, my point is, what we want to see, what these social movements are about, is about a fundamental lack of responsiveness. And I think personally, having been out there and talked to a lot of the militiamen, a lot of the white working, quote unquote, white working class that are for Trump, right? It's the same thing, a lack of responsiveness. We speak because of our education, because of our background, so on and so forth. We speak at a level, we expect them to speak to us in our language. And that's not, you can't represent people in a democracy that way, right? You can't. And like, yeah, that does mean that we're going to get some really ugly conservative candidates. Guess what? Poverty is ugly. It is ugly. Poverty is just as ugly as race in America because the two go hand in hand. Race is a little uglier because the impoverished white people really don't understand why they're there, right? And like, as long as that's the situation, and as long as governments from the Lane County area all the way to, you know, the federal government are completely and totally, you know, unresponsive in any way. I mean, Trump hasn't even really talked about the fires yet. He hasn't really talked about the toll of the fires to these states yet. All he's talked about is forest management. That's not a plan. So I don't know. I think for me, those social movements are about that at its root. On both sides of the divide, we are recognizing that representative government as it stands no longer represents the bulk of us. And the question, you know, it's a populist question. The question is, how do, just like Dr. McClure pointed out, how do we rein that back in, right? And street protests historically in the United States have been one of the main ways on both the right and the left that we have reined that back in, right? That's just my perspective. I'm gonna stop babbling now, sorry. I really hope you are cutting most of this out, by the way.
Alison and Heather, do you have comments? Particularly, Reuben started talking about COVID and what has that done to the dynamics? What does that do to an equity lens and who's affected, and anything you want to go with that?
I mean, I think what COVID does is it provides a really clear empirical showcasing of the patterns of inequality and the communities that are most affected by inequality, because every single solitary way in which inequality impacts families and communities, and every single solitary way that poverty impacts communities is highlighted and amplified by COVID. So, you know, you can look at you know, unemployment, right? Who are the folks that are experiencing unemployment? It's the folks that are always experiencing unemployment, right? When the unemployment rate goes up in this country, it doesn't go up for everybody equally. It goes up for certain communities much, much higher than it does for other communities, right? One thing that I always talk about in my classes is the point at which the state or the national government gets upset about unemployment is when white unemployment becomes really, really high. Well, typically when white unemployment becomes really, really high, it's still lower than the lowest unemployment for communities of color, right? So we can talk about communities of color unemployment rates going down, but when they go down, they're still down at a rate that is higher than the rate that sets us off as a nation, right? And that's about this divide in terms of how we see the world that we occupy is not always a world that recognizes the clear disparities that certain communities always face. And those communities are facing the burdens of COVID in ways that privileged communities just aren't, which isn't to say that we aren't all experiencing hardships from COVID. We are all experiencing hardships from COVID. All of us are. But some folks, some communities, some households are experiencing more hardships, greater sacrifice, greater struggles, more permanent struggles, more significant, more risky struggles as a result of COVID. And we need to account for those families and those households and those communities, because it's the same households, it's the same communities, it's the same families who bear the brunt of the sorts of experiences of inequality always. And so that's about a systems problem. That's about a structural problem. That's not just about a moment problem. And that's right. The protests are about that. They're about this ongoing struggle. The fact that people have been saying this stuff for centuries, have been calling attention to these structural problems of inequality, to the structural problems that keep poor people poor, that keep low-income folks low income, the fact that there isn't social and financial mobility in this country, even though we continue to say that there is, and the fact that communities of color in particular are burdened by those problems, and that even if you are a person of privilege within the communities of color, if you are somebody who's lucky enough to have to have a higher income, to have a great paying job, you still experience racism, right? You still experience the fact of violence to your community. You still walk out in the world as a person of color having to contend with the possibility of police violence. And we all live in a world, right, where we're experiencing climate change in some way. That's what those protests are about. They're about anger because no one's listening, and we're finally in a do or die situation, as Reuben mentioned earlier, and people need to be heard, and they need the state to take them seriously.
Great. Heather?
To respond to what Dr. Gash and the future Dr. Bundy have commented on, I think that the disparities that Alison was pointing to, for instance, the Pacific, they're predictable, and they are a condemnation of systemic classism, racism in our society. I also think they can yield surprises, which is why it is so important for us to be really attuned to and to support really thorough data collection. And I know that sounds wonky, but one of the things that Trump did in his effort to downplay the impact of COVID and the lack of a federal response was to shift who collected the data at a federal level. It no longer went through the CDC, it went through the Department of Health and Human Services. And then that data was not reliably reported back in the way that it had been through the CDC. Here in Oregon, the data on COVID cases has revealed that the greatest disparities, and this is not to minimize the disparities across the board, are among Pacific Islander communities who have a rate of positive cases that is 12 times higher than for white people in Oregon. And why? Why is that? The reason for that is because of the point that Alison brought up earlier, is that the majority of Pacific Islander adults are engaged in essential industries, often in agriculture, in factories where there's processing, and also our healthcare providers. So they're working in nursing homes. They're healthcare aides, and often working many long hours. Where are the possible solutions within the most vulnerable communities? In many Pacific Islander communities, which is, as Reuben pointed out, it's an extraordinarily diverse community made up of Micronesians and of Marshallese and Tongans and those from Guam. It's a very diverse community. And across the board, there often for many families is a deep adherence to faith institutions. Where is the role of possible spiritual leaders, of faith leaders, of community elders? Joe Enlett is the Consul General for this Federated States of Micronesia Consulate in Portland. And he has been very clear about working with the legislature in Oregon to try to address some of the particular challenges, but also bring in some of the possible untapped leaders to address these disparities as they disproportionately impact Pacific Islanders. That approach is a beautiful approach that has been used honestly since the initiation of this country, but it can be used more in Oregon as a way of bringing the challenges of specific communities to the attention of the legislature, and then solutions can be collectively arrived at with the voices of leaders within those communities who know the most about how to address the challenges in the forefront. And the last thing I'd like to say in regards to this rich conversation, not that this is the end of our conversation, but these are problems that require all of us. None of us can opt out. We all have something unique and crucial and important to offer to the solutions that will bring not just the greatest reprieve in terms of a break from the future Dr. Bundy was talking about growing up in his neighborhood. No young person in our country should have to experience the daily stress, the chronic corrosion to our physiological systems. My own personal work is on stress and health. We know that people die younger of preventable chronic disease when they are exposed to racism. There is a rich literature showing that. The reality is to have anti-racism be the norm of the day, to have anti-classism be the norm of the day, to have anti-homophobia, to have all of our communities feel that they live lives of dignity and actualization requires every single one of us bringing the strengths from our own particular life and experience and ingenuity and self. That is, if our voters can demand this of our elected leaders, that they recognize that and the promise and limitation of their own positionality, we will be possibly one step further as a collective.
Thank you. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Alison, Reuben, final thoughts?
Yeah, I would. But my final thought is to echo what Dr. McClure, Dr. Gash had just said again, over and over again. I think we've all been saying it over and over again, right? Like even the candidates have said it over and over again. Like we are in a do or die moment, and that's not just that's not just a statement about like our current president or anything like that. That is about voting. To me, is the root of an agreement to collective management, right? The protests, all of these things are about the state not holding up its end of the bargain, right? We are not collectively managing this community. We are being managed, right? And what these protests are about at every level of the game is about self-management, is about collective management, is about having a voice in these things, right? And as Dr. McClure's pointed out, right? And I think that the most important thing that I would like to leave, everybody listening with is this, as corny as it sounds, and I am a voting skeptic, just vote. Just take the time, just do it, right? Get it out of the way. Like Dr. like Dr. Cornel West said, right? It's an anti-fascist vote. We are no longer voting for, the future. That's dumb. We are voting for who is going to make our jobs easier as community organizers. So it asks everybody to think about that as they go to the poll. Which candidates are going to make it easier for us to collectively manage our future as we figure out what we're going to do with COVID and the impending economic collapse and rebuilding rebuilding the countless lives that we have lost just in the last month to fires, right? Like, how are we going to rebuild? That is the biggest question that any voter can ask themselves right now at every level. And unfortunately, you have to ask yourself that question as a voter first, right? And a community organizer, just until November 3rd. And then you can go right back to all my community organizer, anarchist friends out there. You can go right back to being an anti-state anarchist. I promise I'm going to do it. But go vote. Go vote. Just take one day, November 3rd, fill out the little ballot, send it off, and then go right back to talking about how stupid the state is, because that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm asking all of you to do the same thing. Okay.
Alison?
So I have two children. I have an 11-year-old daughter and a 8-year-old son. And when I think about the most important reason for getting up in the morning and doing the work that I do, and for encouraging them to do the work that they need to do, is because they need a future. And this is going to sound very, very corny, but I'm asking voters to please think about our children, to think about the very the two versions of the future that await them if we don't vote, and if we don't help others who are struggling to vote. And so I would say two things: vote, but if you are lucky enough to be able to easily access the vote, as a lot of us are in Oregon, help other people vote. Help people in Wisconsin vote. Help folks in Florida who are disenfranchised from their ability to vote. Support voter initiatives in Michigan, in North Carolina, in Arizona. These are places where voter suppression is rampant, and the very communities whose lives are most at risk are the communities whose vote is being stripped. And so we need to do everything we can, even in states where the vote isn't as compromised as it is in other states. We need to do what we can to start that coalition building. As Dr. McClure said, we need to do that now. We need to do that to help people actually access their vote. And so I would say, do two things: vote, but be involved in helping others to vote as well.
Thank you. This has been our September 18th, 2020 program, evaluating political candidates through an equity lens. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize some gold sponsors: Pacific Cascade Federal Credit Union, Gatos, Churnside and Balthrop, PC, Evans, Elder Brown and Subert, and our Sapphire sponsor, Summit Bank. Support for the City Club comes from Summit Bank, your local community bank, an independent community bank headquartered in Eugene. Summit Bank serves businesses and professionals in Eugene, Springfield, and Central Oregon communities. For more information, visit sbko.bank. It is our expectation that these taped conversations will be available by Fridays at noon. We want to thank you all for supporting us during this difficult time. I want to offer a special thank you to those who contributed to the City Club of Eugene's 2020 summer fundraising campaign that ran between July 24th and August 31st. I'm pleased to announce that we raised a total of over $15,000. Due to the generosity of some key City Club supporters, gifts were matched, doubling their impact and ensuring that City Club can continue to offer regular programs on a wide range of issues important to the community. These funds will be used to make technological improvements so we can reach more members and listeners and offer more innovative programs through digital broadcasts, videos online, podcasts, And now, of course, our time-honored KLCC radio hour on Monday evenings. We are committed to our mission of building community vision through open inquiry, and we rely on your support to get through these troubled times. Thank you very much for your support. Before we thank today's speakers, there are a few quick announcements. Thank you to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing LLC, Dotson's Photography, Network Charter School, and a special thank you to public radio station KLCC 89.7 for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. Next week, we will start our candidate programs for the election season. Lane County Commissioner race for Position 3 with candidates Joel Iboa and Lori Trieger. Please join us again on September 25th. More details and information about future programs can be found online at the City Club's website, cityclubofeugene.org. Now I would like to again thank today's speakers, Heather McClure, Alison Gash, and Rheuben Bundy. Thank you for an important and compelling discussion. This concludes today's program. Be well and stay safe.